Well folks, the day has come and Mother Nature has decided she's finally had enough of my shelter building. I've built a lot of shelters in the past, but I've never seen as much damage done to my camp by Mother Nature as what we're seeing right here today. Not only has this shelter been taken out by a giant pine tree, but it's also half landed on the shelter over there, which is the Viking house. And this isn't the only shelter that's been taken out. Have a look at this one. And this is the log cabin. And the reason for all this destruction done to the camp and to the shelters is due to the storms we've had during the winter. So before we get any further into the video, let's rewind 4 years to the time when I built this shelter with Mike from TA Outdoors. So back then we built this thatched roof house. The idea was to use materials in this woodland. To begin with, we gathered some cedar lengths of wood. We cut them down and then we burnt the ends. The ends we then plugged into the ground. So the reason why we burnt the ends of the wood before plugging them into the ground was in order to reduce the rate at which the wood rots. When you burn a piece of wood and stick it into the ground, comparing that to a piece of wood that's stuck into the ground without burning, you'll notice the one that hasn't been burnt will rot and break down a lot quicker than the one that has been burnt. We ended up cutting 12 lengths and burning them, and then, as I mentioned, plugging them into the ground. Those created the uprights which we could then build our shelter around and on top of. Well, what I mean is we gathered hazel. We then built them up to make a fence, which we pinned to the walls. After that, we made a bit of a cob mixture. So we took a bit of clay, we took some mud, and we took some straw. We mixed it together, and then we attached it, we pressed it into that woven hazel wall. That created our wattle and daub wall. So although it's been about 4 years, you can see the walls are still pretty strong, they're holding out. But yes, there is mud flaking off it. You know, this is a natural shelter, and it's all about improving the shelter every time there's a bit of damage done to it. This mud and clay and straw, this will fall off with the wind and the rain. So when you have patches, it's about just constantly repairing it to keep it watertight and windtight. And then once the walls were in place with the cob mixture, it was then time to thatch the roof. Thatching the roof wasn't as easy as it seems. I've never done it before. In fact, Mike, at the time, he had only done one project previously where he had thatched the roof. We used local thatch which had been grown, sourced locally. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of effort, and it costs quite a lot of money. But nevertheless, you can see how great this material is. 4 years later, it's still nice and thick, it hasn't slid off the roof, and it's still watertight in there. The main thing about thatching a roof is to make sure there's a thick layer, because if there's a thin layer, the rain will penetrate through the thatch and end up dripping onto you when you're trying to sleep and keep away from the rain at nighttime or even in the daytime. So a thick layer of thatch is crucial when it comes to thatching a roof. I guess we have maybe about this much depth of thatch going all the way up. And I've got to say, I've camped in here many times during stormy, rainy nights, and I've never had a drip fall on me. You can see these trees, they've got very shallow roots. And it's these shallow roots combined with a very wet ground, as well as a bit of wind, which causes the trees to dislodge themselves from their root hold, from their foothold, and land, unfortunately, onto my shelters. Just take a look at how thin this root system is. It can't even be half a meter thick. Normally trees will go right down and have a good root hold. These, they just wobble in the wind, and they wobble on themselves that much and they fall over. But one thing that surprises me is the amount of weight landing or sitting on this shelter. The shelter hasn't fallen down completely, which shows we did actually build quite a strong frame back then. Just take a look at the bend on this tree. It's crushed half this shelter, it's gone over, and it's then landed on that small Viking shelter which I built about 2 years ago. So even though there are lots of trees that have fallen down, there are trees in the woodland on the floor, but the majority of them happen to have fallen right here on my camp. But the damage isn't done yet. I think there's more damage still to come, because these trees, there's 2 trees resting against this big oak tree, and it's just a matter of time over the next week or 2. If there's one more storm, I'm pretty sure those trees will become dislodged and they're going to fall down and completely crush the log cabin, which we'll get to shortly. But in the meantime, let's go inside here and take a look at the damage it's done. So as you can see on this side, the shelter is actually fine. It's still solid, well constructed, it hasn't broken or bent. Whereas this side, well, this is, in fact, right above me is where the tree is. It's going directly that way. And look at the flex in these beams. Look at that angle, look at that curve. This is bone dry wood, bone dry cedar wood. Yes, you can see here we did take the bark off, and that's because we didn't want the wood to rot. The more bark you take off the wood, the less chance there is in moisture or bugs getting underneath that bark and starting to decay or rot that wood. And I'm just really surprised at how these have taken that weight and they've bent, or they've stretched. The amount of pressure put on these and they haven't even snapped. It kind of blows my mind how strong this cedar wood is. It seems this is where the majority of the weight is pressing down onto the shelter, onto the frame, because these two, I think this has been pressed in due to the weight because it's quite low compared to the other ones, and there's a bit of a bend, or you can see there's a bit of strain going on in this one and a little bit in that one. So the majority of the weight is right above me, pressing down onto this. And there's a bit more damage right here. Now let's take a look at this shelter, the mini Viking house. This shelter was built about 2 years ago using materials, again, sourced from this woodland. What I like to do is I like to build a shelter, maybe a few years later, take it down, reuse the materials to build another shelter. And the materials I used, well, before this was built, there was a lean-to shelter. The lean-to was built once again with wood from this woodland, the majority of that being hazel and cedar wood. What I did was I reused the materials. The plastic tarp, I ripped off the old shelter. I then placed it onto the frame, which I built here, and once I'd done that, I covered it in leaves. But one thing I also did was I built a bed. I always like building a bed because I want to build a bed off the ground. One, it gets you away from the cold floor, the damp floor. Two, it gets you away from any insects that like to try and climb into your sleeping bag and keep warm with you overnight. Not very fun. Over the years, I've spent many nights in here cooking food, and I've got to say I've had some great night's sleep right here. And of course, it wouldn't be one of my shelters without putting a wood stove in it. And that's exactly what I did. Using a wood stove, it allowed me to keep warm and cook food, as well as make a fresh cup of tea every morning. And when it comes to damage, well, there isn't actually that much damage done to this shelter. The majority of the damage has been done to that shelter over there. So this had quite a narrow escape. There's not much damage, as I've just mentioned. I do think I can rebuild it. I need to put more layers on the roof, and it should be good to go. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to come back here in a few days' time with a big saw. I'm going to start chopping this tree down to take weight off the thatched roof, because that's the shelter that I want to protect the most. So I do have this with me today. It's a folding saw. What I'm going to try and do is saw through this, and just to take a little bit of weight off this shelter and hopefully off the thatched house as well. And then I'll come back in a few days' time with an even bigger saw to finish the job. So that has definitely taken a bit of weight off the shelter. Now let's check out the log cabin. So wait, I don't know if it's just me, but since taking a bit of weight off that shelter, it seems like I've disturbed quite a few flies. Have a look. There are so many flies. Woo! So this shelter doesn't seem too bad. When I built this, I knew it had a really strong roof. This is a really strong construction compared to a lot of the other shelters that I built. Bear in mind, the roundhouse with the thatched roof, that seems to be holding up the weight extremely well. So this shelter was built about 3 years ago. I used cedar wood from these woodlands. This is wood that had been felled at the time because it's quite a thick, a densely populated woodland. A lot of the trees were felled 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, and it's been ongoing. It even happens today. And because of that, I've used the wood, I've reused it to turn it into a bit of a shelter. Let me explain what I did. So I started off by getting 4 of these large stones. They became these, well, I don't know what they call them, but let's call them a cornerstone. They became these cornerstones, which allowed me to build the frame on top. And to do that, I used my saw, I cut into the wood, I then used my axe and chipped away that piece of wood, allowing another piece of wood to slot straight into it. By continuing that, it allowed me to build the walls, which I then made the frame, or I built the roof, and then by continuing that process, the walls suddenly built up. And here's an example. You can see how I've cut out of this piece of wood, I've cut out of this piece of wood, and they just slot together. I then used a bit of plastic tarp to cover the roof, which I changed about a year later when I decided I wanted to thatch it. And thatching is a lot harder than it looks, especially when you're doing it on your own. The layer I put on was way too thick and it's quite messy. But the point is, the more layers, the less the water, or the less chance there is of water getting into you. And yeah, I've camped in here many times. I've never been rained on. It's never been wet here inside the shelter. But I've also put a wood stove in. And of course, I built a bed. So I built the bed using, again, materials from the woodland. I then put in a few shelves, and after that, I put in the wood stove. The wood stove, as I mentioned earlier, I always put a wood stove in my shelters. It is so nice to cook on a wood stove, to keep warm, and it's just so homely. There's something about that crackling fire, that stoking of the fire every so often. You know, you wake up sometimes at 3 in the morning, yes, the fire's died down, but as long as you have a nice pile of wood next to the fire, you can keep it going to keep you warm and sleep throughout the night. So that's taken off a bit more weight off the shelter. What I'm going to do is come back in a few days' time with an even bigger one of these and continue the job. So what have I learned from this? I've learned that when you clear trees and make a bigger area within woodland, it allows for more wind to come in. That wind can then knock the trees down, which it has done. Southwesterly winds, they've pushed the winds push the trees over onto my shelters. But the main thing I've learned is that the shelters that I've been building over the last few years that have these trees on them, they're extremely strong. Extremely strong. I've no idea how much weight. There must be a good 1,000 kilos in one of these trees, maybe more. If you have any idea, let me know in the comments. Yeah, they're extremely strong, and that's the most important thing, is that if this would have happened when I would have been sleeping in here during a storm, I'm pretty safe to say that I wouldn't have been affected by it that much. I wouldn't have woken up squashed, impaled by branches. However, maybe I was just lucky. Maybe they've fallen onto the shelter and I've just got away with it. It might be, it might not be, but I definitely think these shelters are a lot stronger than I thought they would be. So one thing I want to do is turn this negative situation into a positive situation by using these trees. I feel that nature has tried to reclaim my camp, has tried to reclaim the wood that I've taken from the woods. But I now think I've got the upper hand because nature has just given me some more wood to build with. On that note, what would you build here with this if you were me? What could I do? Please let me know in the comments. I just need ideas. How can I take these things and turn them into a positive? If you're still watching, thank you so much. I'll be back next week with an updated video. In the meantime, don't forget to like it, share and comment, do all that good stuff. See you next time. Goodbye.